Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Paul's Church. On behalf of the people of St. Paul's, I welcome you. We've been in the neighborhood since 1809, and we're glad to always welcome new people. I have two jobs this evening, and the first one you've made very easy, and that is that you get you in your place and for you to be quiet. You've done that perfectly. And my second job is to introduce our MC, whom I'm pleased to say we claim as one of our own, as a graduate and alum of our preschool, and our beloved council member, John Taylor Chapman. Please welcome him.
Well, good evening, everyone. Approximately, what now? 38 years ago, I graced these halls as a young toddler, and so it's always a blessing to come back here and see St. Paul's thriving. I'm going to be your MC this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, members of the military and our military families, and all library supporters, good evening and welcome. Again, it is always not only exciting to be in this space, but it's also exciting to talk about the shared perspectives and history that we have in this community. Thank you to the library board and foundation for allowing an opportunity like this to happen. Definitely, it's great to see my good friend and we'll say classmate, schoolmate, is that the right one? Schoolmate. Tonight and hear from a distinguished panel. Tonight with us, we do have a number of elected officials, and as I am one of those, I know we will have some other folks, elected officials like to fly in and fly out, as it were. And so I know we will have some other folks coming in and joining us. We do have our distinguished delegate, Elizabeth Bennett Parker, who's there in the back. I know we will have, and she'll be mad at me if I don't mention her, but we will have our Vice Mayor, Amy Jackson. She could not stop talking about this event tonight, so I know she will be here as well. Finally, I'd like to read you a statement from our Honorary Chair for this evening as well, Senator Mark Warner, who regrets that he could not be here in person, but he did send this. While I wish I was able to be there in person, I am honored to serve as Honorary Chair for tonight's event. Amplifying voices from our military community, particularly from the Vietnam-era prisoners of war and their family members, is a noble and needed endeavor. While gratitude will never be enough, I want to say thank you to all veterans, active duty service members, and military families in attendance tonight. Our country is stronger because of your sacrifices and your commitment to sharing your stories. Thank you also to the Alexandria Library Foundation for supporting my hometown library and putting on this event. From lending books to putting on events like this, your dedication to the community makes us all smarter, more thoughtful, and more connected. Now it is my privilege to introduce you to Dr. Trudy Hahn, who is president of the Alexandria Library Foundation. Trudy has been on the foundation board since 2017, and before that taught for 4 decades. She was on the faculties of Drexel University, University of Maryland, Catholic University of America, and the University of Kentucky. Her experience covers academic libraries, public libraries, along with special, corporate, and governmental libraries. She's written or edited 6 books, numerous book chapters, and is a sought-after guest speaker. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Hahn.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to the first annual, we hope this is the first annual, author event organized by the Alexandria Library Foundation. We do appreciate your support of this event. There are a few people out there that I would like to recognize, and so everybody can see you, would you please stand when I announce your names? Besides myself, the other members of the foundation board are Councilman Kanek Aguirre, Delegate Elizabeth Bennett Parker, in the back, Oscar Fitzgerald, Oscar, there you are, Diane Fox, Albert Mosley, Albert, there you are, Robert Ray, Patricia Dane Rogers, and of course the Executive Director of Alexandria Library, Rose Dawson. I also want to recognize and express my profound appreciation to the chief organizer of this event, our Development Director, Michelle Stork. Michelle, yes. She's been working tirelessly, and she also, among her many responsibilities for this, she organized some volunteers, and those were the people who greeted you at the front. They not only volunteered to help tonight, but they are regular volunteers from the Friends of the Beatley Library and Duncan Library. So we couldn't hold this event, and in fact, the library couldn't function with all of the wonderful volunteers that we have. And finally, I would like to recognize and thank our wonderful sponsors for their contributions to our community and the military. Please stand. At the silver sponsorship level, a big thank you to Comcast, and yes, so enjoyed meeting you tonight, and Wynn Sheridan and the Alexandria Restaurant Partners. At the literary sponsorship level, thank you to the Friends of the Beatley Library. Dara, is she here? There she is. Thank you, Dara. And at the military sponsorship level, thank you, Military Officers Association of America, there, and also Alexandria Toyota. Good. You will see the other sponsors, including our in-kind sponsors and the host committee on the back of your program, and we thank them all. And we thank everyone who's here, purchased tickets, because all the net proceeds for this event go to providing accessible programming, resources, services, and spaces in Alexandria Library, where everyone is welcome to learn, create, and connect. Now, back to Councilman Chapman, RNC.
Thank you, Trudy, and thank you to the Board of Directors and all of the library staff for your dedication to making our library some of the best in the country. Now I have the honor of introducing our Fort Belvoir military guest tonight. But before I do that, could I ask all the Vietnam vets in the audience to stand up or raise your hand? Let's give him a round of applause, absolutely. Thank you for your service. I thought I was under the understanding that we might have a 95-year-old World War II vet in the audience. Oh, please stand or wave your hand so everybody can see you. Now, any other World War II vets or spouses of World War II vets in the audience? All right, now if I can get all veterans or active duty military to stand, and then finally, all families of the military to stand. Let's give them a round of applause. So our fair city, Alexandria, is not only has a rich history, we have a strong military presence, particularly given our proximity to the Pentagon and so many military bases. We are also the home of several characters in the book, including POW wife Carol McCain, John McCain's first wife, John McCain, and MIA wife Candy Parrish Ellis, daughter of Rear Admiral and Mrs. Donald Engen. and former director of the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, and also a former resident of Alexandria. Let's make sure we give our military a hearty round of applause. Thank you. And now, I'd like to introduce the Deputy to the Garrison Commander at Fort Belvoir, Dr. John Mueller. Dr. Mueller spent almost 23 years on active duty. Yeah, we got to introduce you, sir. Dr. Mueller spent almost 23 years on active duty in the United States Army. His assignments included Egypt, Germany, Fort Hood in Texas, and Washington, D.C. He retired from active duty in 2003, and in 2007 was assigned as the Deputy to the Garrison Commander of Fort Meade, Maryland. In that capacity, he served as Garrison Manager in Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan for 2 years. Since December of 2019, he has been the Deputy to the Garrison Commander at Fort Belvoir here in Virginia. Dr. Mueller.
Well, thank you, Councilman Chapman, for that kind introduction. I will be very brief so we can get to the interesting part of tonight's presentation. So, on behalf of my boss, Colonel Joseph Messina, Garrison Commander of Fort Belvoir, we want to thank you for this invitation. He sends his regrets, but he had a prior engagement that he had promised to attend, which is why he has a deputy, so he sent me. Hey, you know, my passion is history, as I suspect it is for many of you, so I like to begin with a history quiz. You know, a famous American once said, "I cannot live without books." Anyone know who said that? Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to John Adams in 1815. So, of course, Jefferson didn't have streaming live video and Netflix and all that. But even if he had, I think he still would have maintained his passion for books. And it's great to see that that passion is still alive in the city of Alexandria. Hey, another quote that I like, which is, I think, attributed to Albert Einstein. He once said, "The only thing you absolutely have to know is the location of the library." Okay, so anyway, we're honored here. Fort Belvoir is honored to be invited to this event tonight. And I got to say, I'll go off script here. Having talked to many of you and heard some of the stories, seriously, I'm humbled to be here in the presence of members of the greatest generation and all of these patriots out here. So I want to thank you for your service and your sacrifices to our nation. So the book we're celebrating tonight is about wives who fought to make sure that no missing man was left behind, and to make sure that our government tracked down every missing and imprisoned man. And they managed to make that a central issue in the Paris peace talks following America's withdrawal from Vietnam. You know, families are the bedrock of a resilient army, and so it's no surprise that it was the military wives who played such a strong role in demanding a full accounting for every captive and missing service member. You know, we have a saying in the Army now: we enlist soldiers, but we re-enlist families. And so the Army and Fort Belvoir, we recognize how valuable the Army family is to our nation's defense. So I want to quote, if I can, from the book that we're celebrating tonight. "Military families serve their country too. Spouses and kids must endure long separations, knowing their loved ones are in harm's way. They endure frequent moves and must repeatedly find new homes, new neighborhoods, and new schools." And that's just as true today as it was during the Vietnam era. And I think maybe it took the Army a little bit longer than it should have to figure that out. But at Fort Belvoir and throughout the Army, you know, we are committed to taking care of Army families with housing, with schools, et cetera, because we know that at what we call the point of the spear, you know, the soldiers, our nation's sons and daughters, when they're out there fighting the battle, they can't be worrying about who's taking care of their family back home. So I think the Army is trying to do a much better job of that. And my boss, Colonel Messina, Command Sergeant Major Newell, and we all understand that. Mrs. Mueller understood it too. when we arrived in '95, I like telling this story. My wife fell in love with Northern Virginia, and she said, you can PC us if you want, but we're staying right here. And that was mainly because of the schools. So that convinced me it was time to retire. Anyway, on behalf of Fort Belvoir, my commander and Fort Belvoir families, and many of you who call Alexandria home, you can be proud of providing that welcoming connection to the Alexandria Library. Again, I sense that besides being patriots, I think we have a lot of historians out there. Fort Belvoir is just down the road. So if you haven't been there lately, I invite you to come down, whether it's Oktoberfest next weekend or whether you want to come visit the club, which we're spending a lot of money to renovate. It's a beautiful historical post, and so you're welcome anytime. So, sir, thank you, ma'am, thank you for the invitation for Fort Belvoir.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller. We are indeed, I believe, a community of historians. We all understand and love this community that we are in. We understand that we are not the first ones to walk the ground that is here in our community, and other folks have been here before. But we don't always know their stories, and so it's always exciting when someone tells a story about history that we don't know. And Taylor has been doing that, telling, not only with this book, but previous books, telling the story of POWs and military families. And so I think we are in for an amazing treat tonight to hear from this amazing panelist. I'm going to turn it over to my good friend.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to have you here, John, at our, this is my church, so I'm glad to have you all here at my church. We're here tonight to celebrate the power of books and storytelling, but I would be remiss if I did not mention that this is also an evening to celebrate the power of activism by ordinary citizens. And this city has a long and strong history of such activism. We stand in a community that played a role in many of our nation's wars, but what many may not know is that this city also, and our library, were in the vanguard of the civil rights movement. In 1939, think about that year, a small group of young black men staged a sit-in at the Alexandria Library on Queen Street, just a few blocks from here, to protest the inaccessibility of the library to the city's black residents. That was in 1939. A full 15 years before the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycotts and before World War II. Think about how impressive and brave it was for those young gentlemen. But we're also here to celebrate and tell the story of some pioneering activists during the Vietnam War. We have with us tonight several characters from our book. The first is the Honorable Everett Alvarez Jr. He was a man who was shot down in his A4 over North Vietnam at the very beginning of the Vietnam War. He was held captive as a POW for 8.5 years. For those of you who have young elementary school children or grandchildren, he spent more time in captivity than the age of your children or grandchildren. He became a very strong resistor to North Vietnamese propaganda and an inspiration to many of the POWs captured later, almost 600 of them. We have Emily Reynolds, who was engaged to Air Force Captain John Reynolds when his F-105 was shot down in November of 1965, 3 weeks before their wedding. We also have Ann Mills Griffiths, whose brother, then Navy Lieutenant James Mills, disappeared over North Vietnam in 1966. In an F-4B while on his second tour in Southeast Asia. Anne served on the board before she became the leader of the National League of Families of POW and MIA Families, the organization that has led the charge for more than 50 years to account for our missing from the Vietnam War. And finally, we have Judy Silverstein Gray, my co-author, a retired Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer, and former journalist with the Tampa Tribune. Ev Alvarez and the POW and MIA family members who have joined us tonight play a role in our book, which is a story about a small group of women in the 1960s who did what few women of that era could. They bucked tradition, and in fighting for the men they loved, changed U.S. foreign policy. It shares the narratives of a group of ladies who became accidental activists during one of the most tumultuous times in our nation's history. Amidst the noise and confusion of the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the Watergate scandal, this band of wives galvanized a president and a nation around the plight of their husbands, some 1,500 men held as prisoners of war or missing in action in Southeast Asia. But this is not a wives' tale. It is much more than that. Unintentionally, this small cadre of women made the POWs, like Everett, so valuable that getting them home became the only victory left for our nation. Bringing home a small fraction of the 58,000 war casualties became the focus of the peace negotiations. But to understand this, we have to go back to the early 1960s when this story began. Judy, please set the stage for us. Remind us what the early 1960s was like.
Thank you, Taylor. Newly sworn in, Lyndon Baines Johnson became our 36th president. His landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 had passed, along with other voting and social reforms. China successfully tested its first nuclear bomb, escalating Cold War tensions. Southeast Asia and geopolitics were heating up. President Johnson responded by escalating the war in Vietnam. In the United States, however, the median income was $6,600. The average price of a new car was just about $3,000, and fuel cost 31 cents per gallon. A first-class postage stamp was 5 cents, and a dozen eggs cost just 53 cents. Homes had one rotary phone. You could get it in any color as long as it was black or white, and televisions had rabbit ear antennae. Families played board games together, such as Mousetrap, Monopoly, and Trouble. I see a few of you shaking your heads. You remember that. What was everyday life like? Oh, and also, families sat around the dinner table to get their news either before or after dinner, but we only had 3 television stations, ABC, CBS, and NBC. So most of us received our news together. There were only, what was everyday life like for women in the 1960s? And in many ways, it's easy to remember that it was very much like the 1950s. Women still wore white gloves when they went out for a drive or for lunch. They worked as teachers, nurses, secretaries, and stewardesses. They sought husbands and children as marriage provided both financial stability and the source of social status for women. They still wore their hemlines a little bit longer than we are. Oh, except Taylor. But their husbands and sons wore their hair shorter. They did not travel or go out to dinner unaccompanied, and many did not work after getting married. Almost none of them worked after having children. In fact, it was not uncommon to be fired after getting pregnant. It was not easy for women to get credit, a mortgage, or a car without a man's signature. No man, no mortgage. And although the birth control was introduced in the 1960s, many doctors would not prescribe it to single women, and some would not prescribe it to married women without their husband's signature. They needed his permission. Military wives of this era had even more restrictions placed on them. They were expected to assist and support their husbands and their careers, or there were consequences for him. They wore their husband's rank, as many saw the women as extensions of their husbands. Military wives were not to disparage the military, nor violate its strict pecking order and protocols. Each military service issued its own guidelines for wives. and The Navy Wife, one of those books, updated in 1955, was one such book. It painted a picture of an exciting and glamorous life for young women lucky enough to marry a naval officer, social activities, world travel, and exposure to national and international military leaders, diplomats, and politicians. But the tome also counseled patience. What is more, they had to learn to wait patiently. It says, in such situations, it's bad enough to feel tense and jittery, but it's far worse to show it. Wives had to love the military and its hardships as much as their husbands did. They were not to reveal their personal burdens to anyone. Until the Vietnam War, this expectation permeated military culture. And it was against this backdrop that men shipped off to Vietnam, a small country unfamiliar to most Americans. But the conventional wisdom was, how long would it take for a force as big and mighty as the US military to defeat a country the size of New Mexico? President Johnson's advisors advocated for an air war, and in March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder kicked off and the sustained aerial bombing of North Vietnam began. Pilots were shot down by the North Vietnamese. Aviators and airmen went missing. Many were captured and held as prisoners of war. And some of you discussed this earlier tonight, a black sedan began showing up at the homes of aviators. Like a raven circling military base housing, it came to deliver dreaded news. A senior officer and a chaplain would emerge from the sedan in dress uniforms. They would approach slowly, their military covers in hand, and solemnly deliver the message: your husband is missing. Families were stunned. Casualties were a fact of life in the military. Men were killed in combat, but missing, it seemed incomprehensible.
Here we have with us the first pilot who was shot down on August 5th, 1964, in the aftermath of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. He was captured and for several months was the only American aviator in captivity. Everett, can you tell us how your family was informed of your shoot down and your capture?
Well, of course, I was not home to share in that experience. So everything that I know that was relayed to me and told to me years later after I got home. But I can tell you that it must have been a smashing, because it was the very first raid into North Vietnam. And about a week later, after I was shot down, and I was being held in a local a farmhouse surrounded by guards, in my captivity, in the middle of the night. And this is a week later. The English-speaking officer, an interrogator that was with me at the time, came barging in the middle of the night, and he was pretty upset because I had only given them name, rank, service number, and date of birth, as we are required to do at the time. And he basically said, that's all you give us, but we know more about you. And he had a little satchel with him, and he started pulling out news magazines like Time, like Life, U.S. News, World Report, my hometown newspapers, all of the New York Times, Washington Post, San Francisco, with my picture and story plastered all over the front page. And, pictures of me and articles starting when I was in high school and through college and what have you. And so my first reaction was a name, rank, service number, and date of birth is...
They know more about you.
It's not going to hack it here. Anyway, that's another story. But when I got home, I remember that my mother particularly, the story is that my little sister came home from school. It was a hot August day, and for some reason my mother's ironing, and it was very hot, but she was ironing her clothes, and so my little sister, said, I knew something was wrong, and then that morning, my other sister had called my aunt, who lived about 50 miles away, and said, you better get up here. It's about Everett. So this is all I knew, follow on of how they heard. But for years, my mother would say that she had a CACO officer assigned to her. And usually these were casualty assistance officers that were assigned to the families of those who were shot down and POWs missing. And so they could actually, ask questions and had a relationship. The CACO was usually assigned from a location close by.
Right.
And in our case, it was only about 15 miles away to Moffett Field in California. But she talked very fondly about her CACO officer, who was very comforting to her. And the other thing I can remember is that initially they were told by the Navy, don't say anything. Don't make waves. And just, keep quiet, talk to your CACO officer. In fact, it was about a month after I was shot down that I was allowed to write a letter. And I wanted to do that because I was not sure if they knew I was alive. Right. And so I wrote a short letter home, and it was, delivered through the International Red Cross. And I got a response another 3 or 4 weeks later through the Red Cross. And the letter asked an innocuous question, but only one that I would know. And when is your car payment due, and how much is it? And so what I found out later is that they were questioning whether I was alive or not, because the photographs all showed me possibly as a just that of a person that was actually killed. And so that was really the first that I knew and heard about my shoot down.
You talk about how supportive your CACO officer was, your casualty assistance officer was. Carol McCain, John McCain's first wife, told me that the chaplain took her hands in his and said, I'm here for you, Mrs. McCain. I'm in my office Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. And that was the extent of the support that she received. Now, Anne, tell us where you were when the black sedan arrived and your family received a knock on the door.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I was at my parents' home, and the one who came to tell my parents when it happened was a close family friend, and it didn't even alarm me when he came in because he was the football coach for the high school, and my father was the vice principal, and we all went to the same high school, so we were familiar with everybody in the community where we lived.
But he was in uniform.
This time, the car pulled up. Daddy told me that Paul Briggs was coming by to talk. And then I saw the Navy car pull up, and Coach Briggs got out in uniform, and I said, something's really wrong here. And sure enough, he came to the door, and I answered the door because I was standing next to it. And he came in, and I just looked at him, and he said to me, he's only missing.
Only
Missing. And with that, he walked in and started talking to Mother and Daddy, and Mother, sort of fell apart. And I left shortly thereafter, just to leave Mother alone after Coach Briggs left, to leave her alone with Daddy because she was very upset, obviously. And I didn't need to be a further burden by getting upset in front of my mother. So I just went to see some friends and told them what had happened. But it was a major shock, but what I'll always remember is what they said, that he's only missing.
Only missing, as if that's better. And Emily, you were 3 weeks away from marrying the man you called your hero, John Reynolds, and you were living with John's parents, busy planning a wedding. 3 weeks away. Invitations were out. And if you think wives had few rights or advocates during this war, fiancés and girlfriends had none. They had no status and they received no benefits. So tell us about the morning you received the news to Emily. They didn't really want to talk to you, did you? Did they?
Well, in my situation, I was in Philadelphia. My parents had just come in the night before from Fort Churchill, Canada, where my dad had been on a contract up there. And we were all gathering because we were preparing for this wedding. And so the family were meeting for the first time. We were in the kitchen, which is where everybody gathers, right? And just having a good time. The invitations had been sent out. There actually was an enclosure card in the invitation because John couldn't make the first date. So we had an enclosure card printed and slipped it in for the second date. And that was in December, and this was November 28th, actually. So as we gathered, everything was fine. The doorbell rang. Of course, being the youngest in the room, I jumped up and I said, "Oh, I'll answer that door." And I went to the front door, and we actually didn't have too much background that John was flying. This was something that the squadron had been moved to Tockley. They were flying out, but they were due back in a month. So remember mailing letters back and forth? There was not too much known within our family what he was actually doing, except we knew that they had been sent there for a month, and we knew the war was picking up. But when I answered the door, these two men in a uniform, and remember, we weren't on a base, so we weren't keyed to look for the icons that you talked about and other people have talked about when you're on a base. So I just said, I said, "Well, do you have a message? I can give it to Mr. Reynolds." And they said, "No." Absolutely, they just said no very politely, but we need to see Mr. Reynolds. And of course, at that time, Mr. Reynolds was on the documentation for John in the event of any situation. So I went back in the kitchen and I said, "Okay, Dad, you're on. They want you at the door." Well, he went to the door, and you could just tell, because there was this, kind of silence. You didn't hear the, "Oh, hi, how are you? What's going on?" None of that. It was like an undertone. And he came back and told us, he said, "We all have to go in the living room. This is something very serious." And so those two men, and that was 2, 4, 5 of us, sat in the living room, and they told us that John had been shot down. We didn't know the details. They, of course, were not coming forth with anything, and rightfully so. At that point, it may have been too early. But they gave the Reynolds a contact number, and that was about it, for them to follow up, basically, on what had happened to their son. Fortunately, within about a week, the Reynolds were very industrious, and they started connecting with the squadron that had come back. But as Everett just said, there was this tone that this was not to be circulated, talked about much until there was more to tell.
And families like the Alvarezes and the Reynolds and the Mills were told not to tell anyone outside their family that their husband, their son, their brother was missing or held captive. And as Candy Parrish Ellis, who was living here in Alexandria when her husband went missing, told us, Judy and me, she said, "How do you live like that? How do you live like that?" With no other options, these women were condemned to a life of waiting. Families had powers of attorney that lasted only several months. Those quickly expired. Government officials seemed very plotting, very unhelpful, basically gave the women a proverbial pat on the head and said, "We're doing everything we can to get your men home, but trust us, it's classified and it's extensive." So days turned into months, and months turned into years, and only silence from the government. Were these women wives or were they widows? Fast forward to October of '68 when one woman decided to break the silence, Sybil Stockdale. Judy, tell us what she did.
You probably know her name by now. Married for more than 2 decades and the mother of 4 boys, Sybil was the wife of Naval aviator Commander James Bond Stockdale. He had been a captive of the North Vietnamese for 3 years now. She recognized that Hanoi was winning the battle of propaganda in the media, and she watched the anti-war activists claim that American captives were being treated well. But she knew otherwise. With the help of intelligence officials, she and Jim had been exchanging encoded letters. Essentially, Sybil was working covertly for and with the government. Jim's encoded return letters revealed that the men were being tortured and placed in isolation for long periods. Meeting with the State Department point man on the issue of the missing and captive Americans, Ambassador Averil Harriman, Sybil was unimpressed. He assured her that the United States government efforts on behalf of her husband were extensive, but classified. In other words, she only received the proverbial pat on the head. After 3 years of very little progress, Sybil refused to keep quiet any longer. Bravely and boldly, she gave an interview to the San Diego Union. In it, she said, "Where is the evidence that Hanoi is a responsible government in the world community?" she asked. Defiantly, she concluded, "The North Vietnamese have shown me the only thing they listen to is world opinion. The world does not know of its negligences, and it should." Syndicated around the country, many POW and MIA wives read that interview. It gave them the courage to go on.
For Andrea Rander, who was scheduled to be with us tonight but had a sudden death in the family, life during this era brought very different challenges. She was one of very few Army POWs and one of even fewer Black POW wives. Raised in the same community neighborhood in the Bronx as General Colin Powell, she said she never experienced racism until she took a train from New York south to South Carolina and was forced to change trains in Union Station here in Washington to the blacks only train. Several years before she became a POW wife and an international lobbyist on behalf of her captive husband, she and a friend marched into Woolworth's in Georgia in 1964. The 2 gals sat down at a whites-only counter. This was in 1964. Looking the waitress in the eye, Andrea asked very tentatively, "May I get a Coke?" With time, Andrea became more confident, going to Capitol Hill, traveling twice to Paris to stare down the North Vietnamese, and on her second trip to Paris, after a 70-minute meeting with the North Vietnamese alone, she emerged to brief the press and the rest of the wives. By this time, she was a seasoned spokesperson, much braver and much more confident than her first bout with activism in 1964. She briefed the press and said, "You know, the North Vietnamese was more like a broken record. The North Vietnamese had instructed her to go home and tell her children that her husband was a murderer." By '72, Andrea and her fellow activists had achieved traction for this issue of the missing and captive men. They'd bang their fists at the White House, Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, the United Nations, the State Department, the Paris peace talks, and with foreign leaders all over the world. They appeared on the cover of Life and Look magazine. They appeared on national television. More than 5 million Americans were wearing POW and MIA bracelets like the ones we're wearing tonight, each one inscribed with the name of a missing or captive man. How many of you remember the POW bracelets? There we go. It was probably the singularly most popular campaign. It made the fate of these men personal for millions of Americans. That same year, a Harris poll concluded that 75% of Americans wanted to stay the course in Vietnam until the POWs were returned home. Think about that. The fate of these 591 men had eclipsed the fate of the thousands of men fighting and dying on the front lines. Everett, can you tell us what you learned of the activism of these wives while in captivity? What impact did their work have on you?
Well, I'm sure that the activities that we're talking about had a significant impact. How much in the total picture, I don't know. Let me just say that conditions were bleak until September of 1969. Now that was after the Paris peace talks started. And after Ho Chi Minh died in that year, the North Vietnamese changed their policies gradually and gradually started to improve our treatment. So it was a factor, I'm sure, but I could not measure it. On the other hand, those of us that were shot down before the 1968 cessation of bombing of the North knew nothing until 1972, when the bombing resumed and President Nixon resumed the bombing of the North. And it was those fellows that were shot down, and there were a lot of them, that we finally made contact with them, and they started to brief us on what was happening in the United States. And the activities of the League at that time was something that we learned about. We learned about the bracelets that you just mentioned. And they also told us that we were, the POWs were a hot item back in the States. And I quote that because when we got the news from tapping through the walls, or they, like, hot item, what does that mean? And
You were media darlings before you were even home.
It was they said, you know, you're a kitchen talk, kitchen chatter type of it. Well, we had no clue but then we gradually, when we got home,
That's right.
and we started to realize that how the public, the public felt about those of us who had been held as POWs. But you have to give a lot of credit to the women, and of course, Anne can tell you more about that than I can at this point.
And when those Paris Peace Accords were finally signed in January of '73, and 591 men arrived home, this guy was one of the first off the plane. Not exactly the first, but one of the first off the plane. Their homecoming was a national celebration. It was carried live on national television in the middle of the night. Their landing in Clark Air Base in the Philippines was literally the middle of the night here, and it was carried live. Millions of Americans got up in the middle of the night to watch their homecoming. They got homecoming parades in their hometowns, they got lifetime passes to Major League Baseball, and they got a celebrity-studded White House dinner. Now, Emily was living in Pueblo, Mexico in 1973 when she heard about the release of the POWs. And it made headlines around the world, as you can imagine, and she just had to talk to John. So she goes and finds the only place that she can. She's living in a university town, and she goes to a public telephone, very public place, and she makes a phone call to John to John's house in Philadelphia, hoping that she can get him on the phone. And Mr. Reynolds answers the phone, and she says, I really want to talk to John. It's been 7.5 years. She says she was so nervous, her mouth was so dry, she could barely get the words out. But the years just melted away when they got on the phone together. She hopped in her car, drove across Mexico by herself, and reunited with John. And they got married 9 years to the day that they were originally supposed to get married. Now, there's a lot more to the story about why she was in Mexico. You'll have to read the book to hear about it. But more than 20 years later, now she is Mrs. John Reynolds, and he is General John Reynolds, and they were living in Beijing with their 2 children. And guess what? They go back to Vietnam, to Hanoi, this time as tourists. Why? Because John wanted to go visit his old prison. What happened, Emily?
Well, remember, we left off in 1965 in the kitchen. All right. So fast forward now, it's 1995, and we had been in Beijing in the 80s. Now we were back in the 90s. John was had the office for Raytheon in Beijing, and relations had been normalized. Other people had visited, including Everett, John McCain, several others. But we were working, or John was working there in Beijing, and as a result, I mean, you're halfway, more than, what, 3/4 or 7/8 around the world, so you're sitting right there. It seems very logical that you might try and push for this visit. Plus, interestingly enough, it was booked through a Chinese tourist agent in Beijing. So we set off between Christmas and New Year's of 1995, going through Hong Kong, arriving in the embassy, or arriving in Hanoi. That was, we were going from Hanoi all the way down to Ho Chi Minh City. We kept calling it Saigon the whole time we were there, but anyway. Our first stop was Hanoi, and they had not actually opened the embassy yet. They had what they call the advance team and a charge d'affaires. And we actually knew several of those members because they had been in Beijing with us in the 80s and when they were opening consulates for the US. So there they were now, opening up Hanoi to the Americans and to a future embassy. But John had wanted to go back. The opportunity was there, and he did say to me, he said, well, I think the most important part of this trip is that we can go together, meaning we had 2 children that were in college. They had never experienced, like a lot of families, the separation during the Vietnam War. They were born afterwards. And they actually didn't have much choice because we were going, but they obviously wanted to go. It was just a family affair. John had gotten wind of the Sante village, which is just outside of Hanoi.
Where he was held for almost 2 years.
Pardon?
Where he was held for almost 2 years.
There were several POWs there, but they were held in this prison camp. It's probably about 5 kilometers out of, maybe 8 at the most, out of Hanoi. But the embassy group, they were interested because a lot of the South Vietnamese had been held in North when the war was over. So we all decided to go out and see if we could find this prison camp.
And tell us what it looked like when you walked up to that prison camp, which was really, as you said, looked pretty much the same to him.
Well,
just much dilapidated.
First of all, he didn't know what it looked like from the outside. He only knew what it looked like from the inside, so we had trouble finding it. But after we found it, we went inside, and it was stark, grass overgrown, but the row of windows were there with all of the bars, and he went directly to the bar, to the area where he had been held because he had had this little cork bent in his bar, in his room. So he knew that was exactly the room that he had been in. Showed us where they had dug a well, which had never produced any water, and it was still empty. There was an area that was called the tank. The tank was for solitary confinement. And we took a lot of pictures, we walked around. And finally, the South Vietnamese, the guide that was with us, the driver never knew what was going on, but the guide figured it out because of the embassy people and John. He said, I think you should really put your cameras away at this point because we're still using film. He said, because they know we're here now in the village. And the man that had helped us find the village, he had just disappeared, of course. And sure enough, here comes the little armed band woman and nosing around who has what we were doing. But it was enough time for John to show us a part of his life and what he had gone through. We couldn't imagine what he had gone through, but we saw abundantly clear what these locations looked like that the men had been held in.
And you can imagine how surreal that was for John 20 years later. Could he have ever imagined when he was in prison there in Sante that he was going to come back 20 years later with his wife and 2 children? It's instructive to remember that for each of these individuals, even though they moved on from Vietnam, Vietnam is still a part of their life. But what about the missing men? There were still 2,500 missing men, unaccounted for at the end of the Vietnam War. One woman has stayed the course, and that's Anne here, for more than 5 decades. She suffered through the tough times of the Ford and Carter administration when the country wanted to put the Vietnam War and this issue behind it and was only giving the issue of the missing lip service. She worked closely with the Reagan administration when President Reagan changed course and made the accounting of the missing a matter of national priority. She lived through the crazy 80s and 90s when the con men, the charlatans, and the real-life Rambos preyed on many MIA family members, promising they could rescue their husbands and fathers, who many believed were still being held against their will. And she's still working the issue today, primarily with Hanoi and the U.S. government. But she did not know what happened to her brother for more than 50 years until a fisherman snagged a piece of his plane in his canopy, a piece of his plane canopy in his fisherman's net. 20 underwater dives later, government officials pull a piece of osseous material out of the muck, and they confirm through DNA that it is the rib bone of her brother. And they were able to bury him, she was able to bury him, in Arlington in 2019, some 53 years after he perished. But what's interesting about this story is that it is no longer unique. Often newspapers cover stories about a family whose husband, father, grandfather, uncle, brother, son, whose remains have been missing for decades, are repatriated. Thanks in large part because of the work and her organization that she leads still does. And it would be absolutely impossible to summarize the breadth and the depth of your commitment to the work on behalf of our missing men. That iconic black and white flag that flies over every government building, the Pentagon, the White House, the State Department, every embassy in the world, and every post office in this country, you can't drive 5 miles without seeing this symbol, flies there because of the work that Anne did. And it's a reminder of our national commitment to leave no man behind. And you were instrumental in making this a federal law. Can you quickly tell us about that effort? Mike?
She's gonna make me cry. I don't know. Well, it's been long. It's been controversial. It's never been easy. The part of making the flag becomes so symbolic is the easy part because it was here.
Sadly, the league never copyrighted or trademarked that symbol.
That's right. So we've never gotten a diamond profit for all the millions that have been sold and all of the flag makers that have made a lot of money on it. Only one time did one flag company give us a small donation, only once. And that's in 50 years, over 50 years. But it is important. What that flag has represented is recognized around the world. Every country in the world recognizes that flag. And what it means is that because of what we started and because of how hard we fought for assets, resources to be able to get the Vietnam War missing home, not all of them, we never expected all. We knew the circumstances. You'd never say all, you would never say complete accounting. If you heard anybody say that, you know it was,
Impossible.
pre-election rhetoric that had nothing to do with reality. That's why, for us, it was always the fullest possible accounting for those who were missing, always. Anybody says more than that, they're just trying to BS you, that's all it is. But what I will say, that because of what we started, and because of how large it's become, it is the most recognized capability in the entire world and admired for being that. I will also say it gets very frustrating because it's a whole lot easier for a huge number of scientists, best in the world, that we have working on this issue now. It's so much more attention-getting and rewarding in terms of budget, notoriety, commendations, to get home to disinter remains of the known dead from World War II and Korean War, especially World War II. That was the good war, the one that everybody in the world supported. Korean War, less so. But the sight to the American people, who don't always differentiate between the wars, but when you see that flag-draped coffin and the full military honors ceremony of one of our heroes being interred, being identified and interred, it's a pretty striking thing. And there's been a lot of ups and downs. There's no question about that. There is also no question about the commitment. The money's going to be there because they can't abandon it now. It's too well known. And the lab is the best lab in the world. It's recognized as that. They have entirely too much control, in my view, over the accounting mission. And the Vietnam War accounting mission has slipped as they put more emphasis on disinterment, beautiful funerals, beautiful coverage. But we're going to get there, and I just came here, and I'm so blessed to have been able to be available to come and be with you. But it's because the Vietnamese Prime Minister was just in town this week, and I was asked to come in for a celebration reception. The Prime Minister was here, and the most important man in Vietnam, who's the one I meet with most often, which Ev will understand especially, Minister of Public Security, is the heavy-duty guy in Hanoi, and I've known him for over 30 years. The difference and the advantage for me is I've been in it so long, and I'm still at least halfway walking, talking, and breathing and performing as I need to. But many of the senior officials in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, I've known for 35, 40 years. They are now the senior officials in all those countries. That makes a difference because it's that personal relationship. You can disagree with their policies, which I always have. You can't agree with communist policies. Doesn't mean you can't recognize the quality of the person who is representing his government.
Anne continues to work this issue, and I think she will do it as long as she can. In closing, I just wanted to remind everyone that every war produces prisoners and missing men and women now today. But only since the Vietnam War have prisoners become political hostages, so valuable that preventing them in future wars has become a strategic imperative. Not for humanitarian reasons, but to avoid having to make compromises to get them home. And until the Vietnam War, we left our missing. we unilaterally declared them all dead. The United States will still tolerate casualties, but we will not tolerate missing men or captive men anymore. Our military's increased use of unmanned technology helps avoid this threat, and we now expend unlimited resources, mostly special forces, to rescue just one missing or captive man, whether that man is in Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. We have a handful of gutsy women, military wives, to thank for that. They were resolute in their commitment. They were unwavering. Thank you very much. Do we have time for any questions? Yes? Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
As you think about the experience POWs went through, the MIAs went through, and then all the wives went through, how do you?
How about we need you on the mic? Is that okay?
As you think about the experience of the POWs and the wives, 100 years from now or 150 years from now, what do you see as being the legacy of the efforts and the changes in the way people look at war, or just, the combatants? And what is the long-term legacy that we'll be teaching, maybe my grandkids or your grandkids or great-grandkids?
Since he's looking at me, I'll answer it. What I'm trying to do right now, because I was the only non-government person involved in the original structuring of the step-by-step humanitarian process for dealing with Vietnam, and because I never worked for the U.S. government with them, but never for them. And even on trips, I would always make sure the League had to pay my expenses so that nobody could say that the League was bought by or bought out by. I am trying, and my son and daughter-in-law are looking at me, to retire in
I don't believe it.
June of 2024 at our last, I hope, that I will chair, annual meeting. I promised to do that to an anonymous donor. And miracles happen on this issue. We found out by accident that I had a tiny little cancerous spot in my lung. Only a month ago, I had that removed. And don't even have any follow-up to it, other than another CT scan in 6 months. It was an accident. I was blessed. And when we had to vote as a board to dissolve the National League of Families, and I had to post that on our website, this guy called me in my new home in San Diego area, Chula Vista, out of the blue, started asking me questions. I said, wait a minute, who are you? And he told me he wouldn't give me anything much, but he kept asking intelligent questions. Turns out, because we had to vote to dissolve as the responsible thing and a member of the board of directors, he had seen that posting on our website, and he was the one in charge of a foundation. And he said, if you promise that you will stay at least one more year to make sure your organization is on a solid basis moving forward, and you will complete your archival research preservation process with George Mason University, I will pledge to give you $2 million over the next 5 years. So by 2 accidents, still it's got to be anonymous. Nobody can ever know his name. But we have enough money to fund the League, and my only commitment was to make sure I was there to make sure it was on a solid track. So I can't leave, but you guys are all invited to come to our annual meeting in June of 2024. It'll be in Washington, D.C. somewhere, but I can guarantee you the Defense Department, Defense POWMI Accounting Agency will not, as they started out doing, share that platform and share that meeting with the League. Not anymore. We're too critical and we have too much exposure.
Any other questions?
That was a good question.
what is your impression of the Vietnamese government in terms of their believability, openness about the situation, identifying where camps may have been, the prison? How do you see that situation today?
They're really good at what they do. Are they open? No. Are they programmed? Yes. Are they in control? Yes. Are they informed and educated? Every single person who deals with or gets put in charge of any office in the United States or working with Americans has the entire education and background on this issue, every one of them. They know the process. They know what they can do. They just were in D.C., the Prime Minister and others, as I mentioned. What they did during President Biden's visit to Hanoi, not only was the relationship upgraded to the comprehensive strategic partnership level, same as they have with the PRC in Russia, they gave President Biden 14, quote, artifacts, combination of dog tags, personal identification, even a passport or two, and 12 of those 14 were unaccounted for, still missing personnel, including 2 last known alive cases. Then, 2 days later, when they met for the defense policy dialogue, which was just day before yesterday, I believe, they gave him 2 more things. Now, what they did that for is to signal the uninformed, relatively speaking, American officials of what they're capable of doing unilaterally if we press them to do it. And you can bet the National League of Families is going to press them to do it. And in fact, I'm going again in early December to go see them.
Thank you. Is that, we're kind of done with time, or do we have time for one more question? Any more questions?
Taylor, I wanted to add that another legacy of the wives was care for military families. And one of the wives, Mrs. Alice Stratton, who's still alive in Jacksonville, Florida, was possibly the first female to be in a leadership position equal to a 3-star. And she became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Family Affairs in 1984. 85, yeah, for 4 years. And one of the things she looked at was co-locating couples who served, finding resources for children, ensuring that we find resources when families are deployed and when they go missing. So these are really important changes in the military. We have a long way to go, but it's so much better than it was. I wanted to get that for you.
Just remember, military spouses also serve. Yep.
Thank you so much. Emily.
Well, thank you to our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Raise your hand if you learned something new. Exactly. That's our community, learning history and learning perspective, learning stories. So thank you very, very much for sharing your stories. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Alexandria Library, Rose Dawson. Rose is in her 15th year as a Director of the Alexandria Library. Rose.
Thank you, John. Good evening. And on behalf of the library staff, I want to thank the Library Foundation for hosting tonight's event, and I'd like to thank you all for supporting it. This author talk was personal for me for 2 reasons. First of all, I am what is lovingly known as an Army brat. And I was born in Germany when my dad was an 82nd Airborne paratrooper, and he did 2 tours of Vietnam. And when he was scheduled to do a 3rd tour in 1969, they discovered he had heart trouble, and so he was honorably discharged. And so I have a great appreciation for the heroic efforts of these and those other POW and MIA wives, because while my mother did not receive that dreaded visit, I know firsthand what it has taken the additional work that these military spouses have done. And I salute the authors for telling the story and our panelists for lending their voice to this. So thank you very much. Now, secondly, in my role as the director of the library, I am grateful for the value that you all have placed on libraries. Your contributions this evening will support not only books and the programs that we offer to our community, but most recently, the library has purchased a van to drive around the city and offer outreach services in neighborhoods such as Alexandria, and offer programs at places such as Ruby Tucker and Brent Place. And so thank you to the Library Foundation for ensuring that the public library goes beyond a sense of place, but is also a sense of space. Now, this is where I had planned to stop my remarks. However, because of Taylor, so she's to blame, I just want to say that as we prepare for the 85th anniversary of the library sit-in, that 1939 event that occurred because we were the first library sit-in to occur in the nation. Our 85th anniversary will happen in 2024, and I invite you all here to join us as we tell that story. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Well, as we close, I want to thank you all for being here to honor and thank our military and their families, especially our Vietnam veterans, their families, during this 50-year anniversary. We also thank you for your support of Alexandria Libraries Foundation inaugural author event. We appreciate your support of our libraries and our community. The authors and the POW and MIA family members will be available to sign books and answer questions after this event. So, with that, I thank you again for being here, and good night.